Hey everyone, this is writing micro lesson number 6 on the writing self-audit for Honors 112 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So this week is going to be a little bit different in that you're not going to be crafting an essay, writing a new substantive piece, but really this is a week for you to reflect on what you've written so far, to think about your own writing and engage in some self-assessment, and also to review my feedback over several assignments now to try to identify areas in which you might improve as a writer. So in a general sense, I'm just going to talk about how, as writers, we improve, and then I'm going to talk about the writing self-audit a little bit, and then we'll close with a clip from a writer that I really like and I respect as a writer, but I also think he has lots of great things to say about the craft of writing that can be very helpful for you. So we'll close just by watching that. So the first question you might ask if you are really concerned about improving your writing is, how do you improve? And I have some advice here. It's relatively straightforward, but important, I think. So the first thing I would say is that in order to improve as a writer, you need to write, and you need to write a lot. That can be a challenge sometimes. Sometimes we don't want to write. And some of the best writers persevere through that resistance, right? They persevere through that not wanting to write. But the key is to write a lot. And also the best writers that I know, not only are they writing on a daily basis, but they're also reading. They're voracious readers. And that you can think of almost like a musician, where the best musicians are going to have a really extensive knowledge of music from a whole bunch of different genres, and they're going to have all sorts of music that they've been exposed to, music that they're familiar with, and they're utilizing that to learn more about the craft of music, but also to appropriate things. So to steal things. Some of the best musicians, they appropriate things from other musicians, and writers do the same thing. So you need to write and you need to read. There's no way around that if you want to be a good writer. You also have to get detailed and constructive feedback on your writing. So you have to push past the people who are going to read your work and say, oh, this is great, you're such a great writer, to the people that are actually going to dig into it and identify areas in which you could improve. And not only areas in which you can improve, but give you really detailed feedback on ways that you might be able to improve your writing. And then lastly, you have to think about how to respond to that feedback, and you have to be systematic and intentional about it, and continue to work on those areas in which you know that your writing is could be strengthened. So I'll talk a little bit about the writing self-audit, because the goal of this assignment is to get you to engage in that self-assessment and think about steps that you could take to improve your writing. So on the assignment, I've laid out basically what I'm expecting you to do. The first thing is to review your existing work. Right? So at this point, you've done one idea development assignment and 6 essays. So you have lots of different examples of these short essays and lots of feedback from me. But I want you to just go through first and reread what you've written for the class thus far. And as you do, take notes. Try to identify things that you notice you're doing in your writing on a pretty consistent basis. They could be ways that you approach questions, ways that you frame thesis statements, the type of evidence that you bring in. But just review your own existing work and take notes about what you're doing. And then once you do that, look at my feedback. Look at what I'm saying, both inside the text, the comments that are inside the text, but also my kind of synopsis that you'll have in the grade center. And review my feedback as well and take some notes on that. And then just take 20 minutes, a half hour to reflect, to think, right, about what you've just encountered in your own writing. At that point, you can identify areas of strength. That's really important. Sometimes we focus on the critique, the critical areas, but you want to identify the areas in which your writing is really strong, and also the areas in which you can improve. And then the really important step is to think about ways in the remaining assignments that you could improve. What are the concrete steps that you could take to improve your writing? Maybe it's reading the assignment out loud because you're running into these issues with convoluted language, or maybe the thesis statements that you have at the outset are unclear, and so it's a matter of being more intentional in how you approach your overarching argument. Whatever it might be, it's going to be different for each person based on what their strengths and what their weaknesses are. But try to identify some concrete steps and use that as a guide for the remaining assignments as you do these few assignments that we have left this semester. And also incorporate that into your subsequent work. Obviously, I hope that you're being intentional and systematic in writing even after you leave this course. Now, some general tips and advice just in thinking about writing, and this goes way beyond what's in this class. The first thing I would say is that everyone is a writer. So don't get into this, I would say, flawed notion that like, oh, I'm not going to be, I'm not going to be a researcher, I'm not going to be a professor, I'm not going to be a journalist or a novelist, and so therefore I don't have to devote as much attention to writing. I spoke with a guy last week in the forest products industry, and he said that one of the things that they do for folks that are coming into his firm, which basically is just harvesting timber and sending it out to supply companies and manufacturers, is have have recent graduates who are coming into a professional environment write, because writing is so important to what they do. A lot of it is technical writing, and they're writing reports and things like that. But he finds often that the incoming employees will have gaps in their writing, and so they want to figure out just what is their skill level first. That's an area in which you wouldn't expect that writing would be really important, but it is. You're communicating professionally, you're writing reports. Everyone is a writer, right? Regardless of what profession that you go into, you're going to have to write. And no one ever masters writing. It is not a skill that you learn how to do and then you internalize that knowledge and move on to something else. Even the best writers recognize that they're constantly in this state of growth and evolution. So don't get into this notion that if you're not doing well on a single writing assignment that you're somehow failing. You're doing exactly what you should be doing, which is trying to persevere through what can sometimes be a difficult process. I would also say think about writing that you really enjoy. And that can be anything. That could be, fiction stuff that you read for fun, the kind of pleasure reading, right? It could be journalism, like articles that you've really enjoyed reading. It could be blogs and things that you read online. It could be web content. It could be anything. But think about what it is about that writing that makes it enjoyable and how you could integrate that into your own writing, right? I would say the best writers understand their weaknesses. And once you achieve a certain level of skill with writing, it's easy to avoid the areas in which you're weak, areas in which you don't feel very strong. It's a little bit like learning a language, right? Where if there's a verb tense that's really weird and has a lot of irregular forms and is challenging to use, once you have a certain command of the language, you can find ways to evade that tricky area that you have trouble with and still communicate in ways that people will understand. But you're still evading that area of weakness. I would say the best writers grapple with those areas in which they struggle, and they direct attention towards improvement. And that is important. That it is important to try to continue to grow and evolve as a writer and not reach this point in which you can do one thing and do it well and avoid those other areas. And then lastly, I know that particularly in academics, a lot of times we focus on areas for improvement or strengthening, but also knowing what you do well is really important. I would say it's just as important as knowing where you struggle. So don't just focus on critique, self-critique, but also focus on the areas in which you're doing something really well, and try to be cognizant of those too, because those are areas of strength in your toolkit, and you want to know that you do these things well and be prepared to use them. So I'm going to close with just a short interview from a writer named Tana Coates. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes a lot about race. He writes for the Atlantic Monthly. He's written several books now on race in the United States, fairly political books, and he's a phenomenal writer. Right? He writes really, really well. Later in the Civilization sequence, you're going to read W.E.B. Du Bois, who also he wrote about race in the United States, but he would weave in kind of poetry and music, and had this way of talking about sociological and political issues in language that was also really beautiful and just very engaging. And Tana Coates is kind of similar. Like, I really enjoy his writing, and he's a very good writer, and he's a very intentional writer that thinks a lot about his craft. He's a best-selling author. He's the recipient of something called the MacArthur Grant, which is they call it the Genius Grant. It goes to individuals who are renowned in their field and put up on a really high pedestal. And I would say that he deserves it. Here he is talking about writing. This is a guy that has reached the top of his field as a writer. And the way that he talks about writing might kind of surprise you. So it's just a very short interview. It's only about 3 or 4 minutes long. I'll play it for you, and then I'll just say a few closing things at the end.
When I came to the Atlantic, was in a very frustrating period because I knew what kind of writer I wanted to be. I was not becoming that writer. I was looking for a breakthrough, and I was not finding breakthroughs at all. I was banging my head against the wall, and nothing was coming out. So it was very depressing. And so in my first year here, I actually had to finish my first book, my only book, and I had to write my first story for the Atlantic. I had to write an 8,000-word piece for the magazine, which was absolutely, I mean, it was just hell. I was on unemployment at the time. I had been laid off, and I was under a great degree of stress. I think I gained like 30 pounds that summer. But what I'm trying to say is, I think breakthroughs come from that sort of stress. When I got done that piece, when I got done that book, I was clear that these were things that I was not capable of doing before. You know, like the writing was very, very different. The sentences had much more power. And I think a lot of that had to do with the stress I was under. You know, like I think like breakthroughs come from putting in, an inordinate amount of pressure on yourself and seeing what you can take and hoping that you grow some new muscles. You know, it's not really that mystical. You know, it's like, repeated practice over and over and over again, and then suddenly you become something that you had no idea you could really be. Or you quit the field and just say, oh, I suck. I mean, that could happen too, but hopefully you have a breakthrough, I strongly believe that writing is an act of courage. It's almost an act of physical courage. You get up and you have this great idea. Maybe you were hanging out with your friends. You guys were having beers and you were talking about something, and you had this idea, and they said, wow, that's brilliant. Someone should go write it. And you sit down to write it, and almost always what was brilliant before, when you were sitting around talking, is somehow not so brilliant when you go to write. It is as though you have a certain music in your head, and trying to get that music out on a page is just absolute hell. And so you fail. And if you're doing it correctly, what happens is the translation of what you hear in your head, what your idea is in your head, onto the page will almost always come out really badly on the page when you first write, okay? But what you have to do is you have to, give yourself a day, go back, revise over and over and over and over again until you get to something that is at least maybe 70% of what you wanted to do. So you try to go from really bad to okay to acceptable. And then you've done your job. I never really get to that perfect thing that was in my head. So I always consider the entire process about failure. I really, really do. And I think that's the main reason why more people don't write. It's very depressing in that way. I was applying for a fellowship, and the best advice that I got, because I was still junior in my career, was from a guy who I did not get the fellowship to. And he told me that in the field of writing, and in writing for magazines specifically, there are a limited number of places, and it's really, really hard to make a living. But if you are a young person, that you should keep going. Because as a young person, there are a lot of young people who want to be writers. But what happens is the older you get, the path is so tough, and you get beat up so much that those people eventually go to business school, and they go and become lawyers. And if you find yourself continuing up until the age of, say, 35 or so, into your 40s or whatever, you will have a skill set because you will have worked on it for a certain period of time that other people just starting out won't, and the competition will thin out. And so the basic essence of that advice, I thought, was perseverance. And I think that's just so key to writing, perseverance. It's the first thing I say to any young person that wants to talk about writing.
Okay. So I just want to highlight a couple things there before we wrap up. One is that oftentimes we talk about writing as if it's this calling, right? It's mystical and you just have this ability or you don't. And what I like about Tana Coates there is that he challenges that idea. It's not mystical. It's hard work. It's a skill. It's like learning any craft, and you have to work hard at it and continue to improve. So writing is going to be challenging, and it's supposed to be challenging. If it's not challenging, then you're not doing it right, essentially, is what he's saying. It's going to involve failure, and it's going to involve setting expectations for yourself that you're not going to live up to. He says the initial try to write something will never seem as good as this ideal in your head that you have. And the end product, too, will also probably fall short of that. It's never going to be perfect, but it's acceptable, he said. And the key really is perseverance. So I think that's, all of us are not going to be writing 8,000 words for The Atlantic or trying to write, a really powerful book about race and politics in the United States. But we are all going to be writing, and we're going to find ourselves in situations in which writing is really challenging. And that doesn't mean that we're doing it wrong. That doesn't mean we're failing at it. That means that we're doing it right. That means that we are challenging ourselves and engaging in that struggle, that ultimately on the other side of that struggle, we will emerge as better writers. And so that's important to keep in mind, that if an assignment is challenging or you find the act of writing hard, that means that you're growing. And hopefully you emerge on the other side of that experience as a better, more skillful writer with a better understanding of yourself, your own strengths, and what you can do to improve your writing. So try to channel that as you work on the writing self-audit for this week. I'll wrap up there. As I said, if you have any issues, if you want to talk about your writing, I'm happy to do that with you and have those conversations. And I look forward to reading your self-audits. Thanks very much.